Marcus Fletcher had it all: a successful career as a corporate attorney, a sprawling mansion in the suburbs of Boston, and enough money to never worry about bills again. What he didn't have anymore was his wife of 15 years, Diana. Their divorce 3 years ago had been messy, public, and left wounds that never quite healed. So when Marcus found himself sitting in the office of his former father-in-law's estate attorney, he wasn't expecting Diana's name to appear in Harold Williams' will. And he certainly wasn't expecting his own reaction: a sharp, bitter laugh that echoed through the mahogany-paneled room, drawing disapproving glances from the other beneficiaries. But as the reading continued, the lawyer revealed a detail so horrifying, so unthinkable, that Marcus's laughter dried up in an instant. A detail that would force him to confront not only the demons of his past but a terrifying truth he never saw coming. This is the story of a man who thought he had buried his past, only to discover it had been quietly hunting him all along. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss one of our thrilling stories. And if you enjoy this tale of shocking revelations and dark secrets, smash that like button, it helps more than you know. Now, let's begin our journey into the shadows of Marcus Fletcher's past, where we'll discover that sometimes, the most frightening monsters aren't strangers lurking in the dark, they're the ones hiding in plain sight, wearing familiar faces. Music intensifies before fading. The law offices of Patterson and Grimm had always intimidated Marcus Fletcher, despite being a lawyer himself. Perhaps it was the old-world opulence: the leather-bound books lining floor-to-ceiling shelves, the antique globe in the corner that Harold Williams had often spun absent-mindedly during their meetings, or the imposing portrait of the firm's founders that watched over the conference room like stern judges. Or perhaps it was because today, Marcus would be forced to confront the ghost of his former life. "Thank you all for coming," said Elijah Patterson, senior partner and Harold's personal attorney for over 4 decades. His voice carried the gravitas of his 70 years, each word measured and precise. "As you know, we're here to discuss the last will and testament of Harold James Williams." Marcus glanced around the room at the small gathering. Diana sat directly across from him, her copper hair pulled back in a tight bun, her emerald eyes deliberately avoiding his. She wore a simple black dress, designer, no doubt, and a single strand of pearls that had belonged to her mother. Despite himself, Marcus noted she looked well. Better than well. Next to Diana sat her younger brother, Michael, whose red-rimmed eyes and rumpled suit told the story of a man who had actually loved Harold, unlike Marcus, who had merely tolerated the old man for Diana's sake. Harold's longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, sat quietly in the corner, her hands folded neatly in her lap. And at the far end of the table was a face Marcus didn't recognize: a young man, perhaps in his early 30s, with Harold's distinctive cleft chin and piercing blue eyes. "Before I begin," Patterson continued, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "Harold recorded a video message to be played at this reading. He was quite insistent about it." The attorney nodded to his assistant, who dimmed the lights and started the projection. Harold's face filled the screen, gaunt from his battle with cancer, but his eyes still sharp with intelligence. He wore his favorite cashmere sweater, the one Diana had given him for Christmas 5 years ago. "If you're watching this, then I've finally lost the one fight I couldn't win," Harold began, his voice raspier than Marcus remembered. "First, I want to say I love you all, well, most of you." His eyes seemed to bore directly into Marcus, who shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. "I've lived a long life, made my share of mistakes, and kept more secrets than was probably wise. Some of those secrets are coming to light today. I ask for your understanding, if not your forgiveness." Harold coughed, and the camera shook slightly as someone, Mrs. Chen, presumably handed him a glass of water. "To business, then. Elijah has my formal will, but I wanted to explain certain decisions myself." Harold detailed several straightforward bequests: his vacation home in Cape Cod to Michael, a generous pension for Mrs. Chen, substantial donations to his favorite charities. Then he paused, taking a deeper breath. "And now, to Diana and Marcus." Marcus felt his body tense. He hadn't expected to be mentioned at all, let alone in the same breath as his ex-wife. "Diana, my beloved daughter. You've been the light of my life since the day you were born. Despite our disagreements over the years, particularly about your choice of husband, Harold's eyes flicked toward the camera with undisguised disapproval. I've always wanted only your happiness. I'm leaving you my primary residence and 30% of my remaining estate. Diana nodded silently, a single tear tracking down her cheek. As for Marcus, Harold continued, his tone cooling perceptibly. Despite our difficult relationship and the way you treated my daughter, I find myself in the unexpected position of being indebted to you. A murmur ran through the room. Marcus's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Therefore, I am leaving you 10% of my estate, with conditions that Elijah will explain. And I'm leaving another 15% to be placed in trust for the benefit of someone else, someone both you and Diana know intimately. It was at this point that Marcus let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. The idea that Harold Williams, who had made no secret of his contempt for his former son-in-law, would leave him anything was absurd enough. But to suggest there was someone Marcus and Diana both knew intimately was even more ridiculous. After their divorce, they had systematically excised all mutual friends from their lives, dividing their social circle like property. Something amusing, Mr. Fletcher? Patterson asked, his disapproval evident as he paused the video. Sorry, Marcus replied, not feeling sorry at all. Just surprised the old man remembered me in his will. We weren't exactly Christmas card material. Diana's eyes flashed dangerously. Show some respect. Let's continue, Patterson said firmly, restarting the video. Harold's face reappeared, now with a strange smile playing at his lips. If Marcus is laughing right now, and I suspect he is, he won't be for long. The person I'm referring to is someone neither of you have met, but whose existence affects you both profoundly. Elijah has a sealed envelope containing the details. I ask that he open it now and share its contents. The video ended, and Patterson reached for a thick manila envelope on the table. The attorney's hands, Marcus noticed with growing unease, were trembling slightly. Before I open this, Patterson said gravely, Harold instructed me to inform all of you that the contents of this envelope have been independently verified. The documentation is authentic. The room fell silent as Patterson broke the seal and removed several documents and a smaller envelope. He studied them for a moment, his expression changing from professional detachment to something Marcus couldn't quite identify, pity, perhaps. Or horror. Well? Diana prompted, her voice tight with tension. Patterson cleared his throat. According to these documents, Harold commissioned a private investigation 3 years ago, shortly after your divorce. He looked between Marcus and Diana. The investigation concerned a girl born 7 years ago at Boston Memorial Hospital. Marcus felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. DNA tests confirm she is the biological daughter of both Marcus Fletcher and Diana Williams Fletcher. The silence in the room was deafening. That's impossible, Diana whispered, her face draining of color. We never had children. The child was born with serious congenital health issues, Patterson continued, his voice dropping lower. She was placed for adoption immediately after birth through an agency called New Beginnings. The records indicate the adoption was closed and arranged while Diana was unconscious following complications during delivery. Marcus's mind was reeling. This is insane. Diana was never pregnant. We tried for years, but, according to the medical records, Patterson interrupted, Diana was admitted to Boston Memorial under her middle name and mother's maiden name Elizabeth Spencer while you were on a business trip to Tokyo. She delivered a baby girl on June 4, 15 weeks premature. The child weighed just under 2 pounds. Diana's hands were shaking violently now. No. No, that's not possible. I would remember. Her voice broke. The hospital records indicate you were heavily sedated due to preeclampsia and post-delivery complications. You were unconscious for nearly 36 hours. A terrible suspicion was forming in Marcus's mind. He turned to Diana, whose eyes were wide with shock and confusion. The adoption papers bear the signature of Marcus Fletcher as the father, authorizing the adoption, Patterson continued, laying a document on the table. Marcus lunged forward, grabbing the paper. There was his signature, perfect in every detail, from the distinctive loop of the F to the sharp cross of the T, except he had never signed it. "This is a forgery," he snapped, his lawyer instincts kicking in through the haze of confusion. "No," said Patterson quietly. "Harold confirmed before his death that he forged your signature, using documents from your law firm as reference. He believed he was acting in the best interest of his daughter and grandchild." The young man at the end of the table spoke for the first time. "The child's name is Emma Grace. She's been in foster care for the past 3 years, following the death of her adoptive parents in a car accident." "And who exactly are you?" Marcus demanded, struggling to process the bombshell that had just detonated in his life. "Jason Williams," the young man replied. "Harold's son from his first marriage. I'm a social worker with the Department of Children and Family Services. I've been overseeing Emma's case since her adoptive parents died." Diana had gone completely still, her face blank with shock. "Where is she now?" Jason's expression softened. "She's at Boston Children's Hospital. She needs a kidney transplant within the next 3 months or she won't survive." And that was the terrifying detail that silenced Marcus's laughter, not just the existence of a daughter he never knew, but the revelation that she was dying, and that according to the documents Harold had collected, Marcus was one of only 2 people in the world who could save her life. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of rage, confusion, and disbelief for Marcus. After the reading of the will, he had stormed out of Patterson's office, ignoring Diana's calls for him to wait. He needed space, needed to think, needed to make sense of the bombshell that had just been dropped on his carefully constructed life. But the next morning, Patricia Wells, his secretary of 12 years, had placed a thick folder on his desk without a word. Inside were copies of all the documents Patterson had revealed, plus additional medical records showing genetic compatibility tests that confirmed what Marcus already suspected: he was a perfect match for the kidney donation that could save Emma's life. Now, standing outside room 417 of Boston Children's Hospital, Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He wasn't sure what had compelled him to come here. Curiosity? Obligation? Or perhaps something deeper he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Before he could second-guess himself, the door opened, and Diana emerged, her eyes widening in surprise at the sight of him. "I didn't think you'd come," she said, her voice hoarse as if she'd been crying. Marcus shrugged, aiming for nonchalance but missing by a mile. "I needed to see for myself." Diana stepped aside wordlessly, allowing him to enter the room. The first thing that struck Marcus was how small the child looked in the hospital bed. Emma was tiny, her skin nearly translucent, dark circles under her eyes making them appear too large for her delicate face. A forest of tubes and wires connected her to various machines that beeped and hummed in the background. Despite her obvious illness, Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. The child had Diana's copper hair, thinner and duller from her condition, but unmistakable, and what appeared to be his own straight nose and stubborn chin. "She's been sedated for a procedure," said a quiet voice from the corner of the room. Marcus turned to find Jason Williams watching him carefully. "You knew about her all along?" Marcus asked, unable to keep the accusation from his voice. Jason shook his head. "Not until about 6 months ago. Harold contacted me after her foster placement was struggling. He'd been keeping tabs on her through a private investigator." "Why didn't he tell us sooner?" Diana asked, the question clearly one she'd been grappling with since the will reading. "He was going to," Jason replied. "After he learned about her medical condition worsening last year. But then his own cancer returned, and things deteriorated quickly. He hesitated. I think he was afraid of dying without making things right." Marcus let out a bitter laugh. "Right? He forged my signature, gave away our child without consent, and kept her existence secret for 7 years. Then springs it on us from beyond the grave when she needs a kidney. That's your definition of making things right?" Diana flinched at his words. "Marcus, please. Not here." "Then where, Diana?" Where should we have this conversation? Because I'm still trying to understand how my wife of 15 years was pregnant and gave birth without my knowledge. The monitors connected to Emma beeped a warning as the child stirred slightly. Outside, Jason said firmly, gesturing toward the door. Now. In the hallway, Marcus paced back and forth, his emotions threatening to overwhelm his usually controlled demeanor. I need answers, Diana. Real ones. Diana leaned against the wall, suddenly looking every day of her 41 years. I didn't know I was pregnant, she said quietly. I thought it was impossible after all our failed attempts. You were 7 months along and didn't notice? Marcus scoffed. 3 months, Diana corrected. She was born at 24 weeks. And no, I didn't notice. I'd stopped having regular periods years before due to endometriosis. The weight gain was minimal. My doctor thought it was stress and perimenopause. She closed her eyes. I was having terrible back pain that day. I thought it was from the new Pilates class I'd started. By the time I realized something was seriously wrong, I could barely stand. Why didn't you call me? Marcus demanded, though some of the heat had left his voice. You were in Tokyo closing the Nakamura deal. The one you said would make or break your bid for partner. Her eyes met his, challenging. The one you said nothing should interrupt, under any circumstances. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow as he remembered that conversation. He had been so focused on his career, so determined to make partner. I called my father instead, Diana continued. He took me to the hospital. When the doctors said I was in premature labor, I panicked. They had to sedate me because my blood pressure was dangerously high. She wrapped her arms around herself. The next thing I remember clearly is waking up almost 2 days later. My father told me the baby hadn't survived. He lied to you, Marcus said flatly. Diana nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. According to the records, Emma was alive but barely. The doctors didn't expect her to make it through the night. My father made a decision, she trailed off. A decision that wasn't his to make. Marcus exploded. He had no right. I know that now, Diana replied, her voice strengthening. But at the time, he thought he was protecting me from more heartbreak. We'd been through so much trying to have a baby. The fertility treatments, the miscarriages. That doesn't excuse what he did. No, it doesn't. But it explains it. He thought she would die, Marcus. When she survived against the odds, he was too far committed to his lie. Marcus shook his head, still struggling to process everything. And the adoption? My forged signature. Harold had connections with the adoption agency, Jason interjected, joining them in the hallway. He called in favors, expedited the process. The couple who adopted Emma the Davidsons knew she had health issues, but they fell in love with her immediately. They provided excellent care for her. Until they died, Marcus said. And then what? She just got lost in the system. Jason's expression hardened slightly. Foster care is complicated, especially for medically complex children. I've been advocating for Emma since I took her case, but resources are limited. When her condition began to deteriorate last year, they ran compatibility tests on all available relatives of the Davidsons, but there were no matches. Which is when Harold decided to finally come clean, Diana finished. Yes. He hired a private investigator to confirm Emma's parentage through DNA, then contacted me. We were in the process of reaching out to both of you when his health took a turn for the worse. Jason paused. He made the will arrangements as a backup plan. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, feeling the anger that had sustained him beginning to ebb, replaced by a complicated mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. The kidney donation, he said finally. What's involved? Diana looked at him sharply. You're considering it? I'm asking questions, Marcus replied. That's what lawyers do. Jason seemed to relax slightly. It's major surgery, but the risks for the donor are relatively low. Recovery time is about 4 to 6 weeks. And for Emma? What are her chances if she gets the transplant? Good. Not perfect, she'll need medication for the rest of her life, and there could be complications, but without it. Jason didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I need time to think, Marcus said, turning to leave. She doesn't have much time, Marcus, Diana called after him, her voice breaking. Marcus paused but didn't turn around. I know. But I can't make this decision standing in a hospital hallway after learning my entire life has been a lie. He took a deep breath. I'll call you tomorrow. As he walked away, Marcus couldn't shake the image of the tiny girl in the hospital bed, a child with Diana's hair in his chin. A child who, against all odds, existed. His daughter. That night, alone in his condo overlooking the Boston skyline, Marcus found himself pulling out old photo albums, relics from his marriage that he'd never had the heart to discard. There was Diana on their honeymoon in Bali, her smile radiant as she stood ankle-deep in the turquoise water. There they were at their housewarming party for the Victorian home they'd lovingly restored. And there, in the back of the album, was the last photo they'd taken together before everything fell apart, a Christmas card picture, both of them smiling stiffly, the strain already evident in their eyes. It had been such a gradual deterioration, his increasing work hours, her growing resentment, both of them silently blaming each other for the children they couldn't conceive. By the end, they'd become strangers sharing a house, their communication reduced to logistics and accusations, except there had been a child after all. A child neither of them had known about, who had been growing up with another family, fighting for her life without either of her biological parents by her side. The thought hit Marcus with unexpected force, bringing with it a wave of grief so intense he had to sit down. What must Emma have endured? What kind of life had she lived? And how much of her suffering could have been prevented if they'd known about her from the beginning? For the first time since the reading of the will, Marcus allowed himself to really feel the magnitude of what had been taken from them, not just their child, but the chance to be parents together, the opportunity to watch Emma grow, to protect her, to love her. The realization brought with it another, more unsettling thought. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the lies, Harold Williams had ensured that Marcus and Diana would be forever connected through Emma. Whether by design or by accident, the old man had created a situation where they would have to face not only their daughter but each other, and perhaps, Marcus thought as he closed the photo album, that had been Harold's true intention all along. The 15th floor of Boston Memorial Hospital housed the transplant center, a place Marcus had never imagined he'd find himself. Yet here he was, sitting in Dr. Elena Patel's office as she explained the kidney donation process in detail. As I mentioned, the risks to you as a donor are relatively small, Dr. Patel was saying, her manner both professional and compassionate. But I want to be absolutely clear that this is major surgery. There will be pain, recovery time, and you'll need to make some lifestyle adjustments afterward. Marcus nodded, his eyes fixed on the anatomical model on her desk. And you're certain I'm a match? No chance of rejection? The genetic tests show you're an excellent match. That doesn't completely eliminate the risk of rejection, but it significantly reduces it. She leaned forward. Mr. Fletcher, I understand these are extraordinary circumstances. If you need more time, she doesn't have more time, Marcus interrupted. That's what everyone keeps telling me. Dr. Patel's expression softened. That's unfortunately true. Emma's condition is deteriorating. Without a transplant in the next 6 to 8 weeks, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Marcus had heard it all before from Jason, from the other doctors, from Diana, who had barely left Emma's side in the week since the will reading. Marcus hadn't planned to come to the hospital today. He'd told himself he needed more time, needed to consult his own doctors, needed to think through the legal implications. All of which was true, but also excuses. The reality was, he was terrified. Not of the surgery, but of the responsibility that came with acknowledging Emma as his daughter. His indecision had ended abruptly this morning when he'd received a text from Diana, not words, just a photo of Emma awake in her hospital bed, attempting a smile despite the tubes and monitors. Her eyes, he'd noticed with a jolt, were exactly like his mother's, a distinctive hazel with flecks of gold around the pupils. Something had shifted inside him in that moment, as if a door long locked had suddenly been flung open. He'd called Dr. Patel's office immediately to schedule the consultation. "If I do this," Marcus said, "now, what happens next? To Emma, I mean." Dr. Patel's gaze was steady. "Medically, if all goes well with the transplant, she'll begin a recovery process. It won't be easy. There's the risk of rejection, infections, complications. She'll need to take anti-rejection medication for the rest of her life." She paused. "Beyond that, her situation is complicated. She's currently a ward of the state. And if Diana and I wanted to change that?" The question surprised Marcus as much as it seemed to surprise Dr. Patel. That would be a matter for family court and DCFS, but as biological parents whose rights were never legally terminated, she shrugged. Jason Williams would be the person to discuss that with. Marcus nodded, feeling strangely calm despite the enormity of what he was considering. "I want to proceed with the donation. What's the next step?" By the time Marcus emerged from Dr. Patel's office, he'd completed preliminary paperwork, scheduled additional testing, and set a tentative date for the surgery 2 weeks from today. The reality of his decision was still sinking in as he made his way to Emma's room, where he knew Diana would be waiting. He found them together, Diana reading aloud from a dog-eared copy of Charlotte's Web, Emma listening with heavy-lidded eyes that brightened slightly when she noticed Marcus in the doorway. "Hey," Diana said, closing the book. "I didn't know you were coming today." "Neither did I," Marcus admitted, stepping into the room. He nodded toward Emma. "How is she?" "Tired," Diana replied. "But she ate some jello earlier, which the nurses were excited about." Marcus moved closer to the bed, feeling awkward and out of place. "Hi, Emma. I'm Marcus." The little girl studied him with those hazel eyes, his mother's eyes. "Are you the one who might give me a kidney?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, weak but direct. Marcus blinked in surprise. "You know about that?" Emma nodded solemnly. "Jason explained it. He said you and Diana are my birth parents, but you didn't know about me until now because my grandpa made a mistake." Marcus glanced at Diana, who gave a small shrug. "We decided honesty was best, in age-appropriate terms." That's right," Marcus said, turning back to Emma. "And yes, I am going to give you a kidney. I just talked to Dr. Patel about it." Diana inhaled sharply. "You are? When?" 2 weeks, if the final tests go well." Marcus pulled up a chair beside the bed, opposite Diana. "I have more appointments tomorrow." Emma's pale face brightened slightly. "So I'll get better?" "That's the plan," Marcus said, surprising himself with how natural the words felt. "It won't be easy, and it'll take time, but yes, you should get better." "Thank you," Emma whispered, her eyelids drooping with fatigue. "You should rest," Diana said gently, smoothing Emma's copper hair away from her forehead. "We can talk more later." Within moments, Emma had drifted off to sleep, her breathing shallow but steady. Marcus watched her for a long moment, trying to reconcile the reality of this child, his child, with the years of believing he would never be a father. "Thank you," Diana said quietly, echoing Emma's words. "I wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I," Marcus admitted. He met Diana's gaze across the hospital bed. "What happens after, Diana? If the transplant works? She can't just go back into the system." Diana's eyes widened slightly. "Are you suggesting?" "I don't know what I'm suggesting," Marcus interrupted. "I just know that now that I've met her, now that I know she exists, I can't walk away." "Neither can I." Diana's voice was firm. "I've been talking with Jason about temporary guardianship while we explore more permanent options. The unspoken question hung between them: would those permanent options involve both of them, together? It seemed impossible given their history, yet also increasingly difficult to imagine any other solution. Before either could address it directly, Jason appeared in the doorway, his expression troubled. "I need to speak with both of you," he said without preamble. Privately. In the small consultation room down the hall, Jason didn't waste time with preliminaries. "We have a problem. The trust Harold set up for Emma's care is being challenged by his former business partner, Raymond Cartwright." "On what grounds?" Marcus demanded, his lawyer instincts kicking in immediately. "He's alleging that Harold wasn't of sound mind when he made his recent will changes, that his illness had affected his judgment." Jason ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "It's nonsense, of course, but it could tie up the funds for months or even years." "Funds that are needed for Emma's care," Diana said, her voice tight with concern. "Not just the medical expenses, those are mostly covered by state insurance, but the specialized care she'll need during recovery, the medications, the adaptive equipment." Jason looked between them. "There's more. If the challenge is successful, it could potentially impact the legal groundwork we've been laying for you to establish parental rights." Marcus leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Cartwright. That's the same Raymond Cartwright who tried to force Harold out of their firm 5 years ago?" Jason nodded. "The very same. There's bad blood there." "I know," Marcus said grimly. "I advised Harold during that dispute." Diana's eyes widened. "You never told me that." "Client confidentiality," Marcus shrugged. "And it wasn't exactly something that came up in casual conversation." He turned back to Jason. "I still have the files from that case. Cartwright isn't as clean as he pretends to be. If he wants a legal battle, I'm more than happy to give him one." For the first time, Jason smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. Harold always said you were a shark in the courtroom." "Harold said that?" Marcus couldn't hide his surprise. "He may not have approved of you as a son-in-law, but he respected your legal abilities," Jason confirmed. "He told me once that if he ever needed someone to fight for him, he'd want you in his corner." Something shifted in Marcus's chest at those words, a loosening of the resentment he'd carried toward Harold for years. "Well," he said, straightening his shoulders. "It looks like I'll be fighting for him after all. And for Emma." Diana reached across the table, hesitating briefly before placing her hand over Marcus's. "For all of us," she corrected softly. 3 months later, Marcus stood at the window of his condo, watching the autumn leaves swirl across the Boston Common below. His side still ached occasionally where the surgeons had removed his kidney, but the pain was minimal now, a small price to pay for the miracle of Emma's recovery. The transplant had been successful. There had been a few scary days of waiting to see if Emma's body would accept the kidney, but ultimately, the doctor's optimism had been justified. She was now living in Diana's home, growing stronger by the day, her copper hair regaining its shine, her hazel eyes bright with curiosity about the world she was finally well enough to explore. The legal battle with Cartwright had been resolved more quickly than anyone anticipated. It turned out that Marcus's knowledge of the old dispute had been even more valuable than expected. Cartwright had backed down after a single meeting where Marcus had quietly laid out exactly what would become public if he pursued his challenge. The trust was safe. Emma's future care was secure. And something else unexpected had emerged from the chaos of the past months, a tentative rebuilding of bridges Marcus had thought forever burned. He and Diana weren't back together, not in the conventional sense. The wounds of their divorce ran too deep for that kind of simple resolution. But they were partners again in a way they hadn't been for years, united by their love for the daughter they were only just getting to know. Tonight, Emma would stay with Marcus for the first time, a sleepover that both of them had been planning for weeks. He'd transformed his home office into a bedroom for her, painted lavender, her favorite color, with star-shaped lights strung across the ceiling. His phone buzzed with a text from Diana, "We're downstairs. Emma made you a card and is insisting on hand-delivering it." Marcus smiled, slipping the phone back into his pocket. As he moved toward the door, he caught sight of Harold Williams' portrait, the one item from the will that had surprised him most. Harold had left it to Marcus with a note, to remind you that second chances sometimes come from unexpected places. At the time, Marcus had considered refusing it. Now, he was glad he hadn't. Whatever else Harold had done wrong, and the list was substantial, he had ultimately ensured that Emma would have both her parents in her life. That she would have a chance at health, at happiness, at the family none of them had known was possible. Marcus opened his front door, hearing the elevator ding down the hall. In a moment, Emma would come barreling toward him, her energy belying the seriousness of her recent surgery. Diana would follow more sedately, carrying the overnight bag they'd packed together, her smile cautious but real, and in that moment, Marcus knew with absolute certainty that Harold had been right. Second chances did come from unexpected places, sometimes even from beyond the grave, delivered in the form of a terrifying detail revealed by a lawyer on a rainy Boston afternoon, the same detail that had silenced his laughter and changed his life forever. Emma's recovery continued to amaze her doctors. By the 6-month mark post-transplant, she was attending school part-time, making friends, and showing an aptitude for art that delighted her parents. The shadows under her eyes had disappeared, replaced by the healthy glow of a child finally free from constant pain and fatigue. Marcus and Diana established a co-parenting arrangement that surprised everyone with how well it functioned. 3 days at Diana's elegant brownstone, 3 days at Marcus's modern condo, and Sundays spent together as a family, often at the public garden, where Emma loved to watch the swan boats glide across the pond. Their relationship remained complicated. There were moments of tension, old arguments that threatened to resurface, boundaries that needed to be re-established. But there were also moments of unexpected connection, shared laughter over Emma's latest declaration, quiet conversations on Diana's porch after Emma had gone to bed, a gradual rediscovery of the people they had become in the years apart. Marcus stepped back from his punishing work schedule at the law firm, delegating cases and turning down the partnership track that had once been his singular focus. Instead, he established a foundation in Emma's name, dedicated to supporting children with rare medical conditions and their families. The foundation.